Thank you very much for coming out to join me tonight for this webinar. This is the first time that I'll be doing something like this, and it's also the first time our agency will be doing something like this. So thank you very much for taking the time to participate in this alongside us, and I hope that you'll get some useful information out of this tonight. So a little bit of information about the webinar. It is on exploring and managing emotions. Tonight I'm going to be talking about emotions and emotional regulation, as well as some healthy coping skills and strategies you can use at home or within your classroom to teach these skills to children. So a little bit about me. My name is Emily Glencross. I'm a program coordinator with the Learning Disabilities Association of Niagara Region. I've been working with the organization in this role for around 2 years now, and I began with the organization in 2015. So I've been involved with the organization for around 5 years, but I've been in this role for almost 2. I'm responsible for coordinating BEST Reading Rocks in SLAM. BEST is called Better Emotional and Social Times. That is our small group self-advocacy and coping skills program. So I have the pleasure of coordinating that. And that's also where a lot of the information I'll be speaking on tonight has come from, is my experience with that program. I guess a little on my background. I attained a BA in sociology from Brock in June of last year. And I have a very big passion for working with children and youth, as well as community programming, and I have a really big interest in social issues, and I intend to go into social work. So that's just a little bit about my background and kind of some of the interests that I have, and I hope that you guys will see some of that in this presentation this evening. So we wanted to begin by talking a little bit about our organization, the Learning Disabilities Association. I assume if you're on here, you are likely already familiar with us. However, I know there are probably some people who may have heard of this from word of mouth, or maybe this is your first time encountering our organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about us and what we do, and then I'll get right into the webinar. So we're a chapter of the Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario. That would be our provincial body. And we're also a registered charity. So we're a registered nonprofit. Our mission is to provide resources and support to individuals who are affected by learning disabilities within the Niagara region. So at this point in time, that's mostly children and their families. We provide leadership in learning disabilities advocacy, research, education, and services. Now we're going to talk about exploring and managing emotions. So now we're getting into the webinar. So this is the agenda for the webinar. So this is what we'll be going over. I'm going to begin by discussing emotional regulation and learning difficulties. Then we're going to go into exploring and defining emotions. So what is emotions? What are emotions as a broad category, and how do we define that? Emotions and self-regulation, so how self-regulation is impacted and how self-regulation plays a part in your emotional regulation. Teaching emotions to children will be the next portion of this webinar, and then we will get into at-home activities for managing emotions. And again, a lot of those activities can be modified to use in a classroom or small group environment if you are coming into this webinar as an educator. So this is a definition of emotional regulation that I really like. This came from some research done by psychologist James Gross. So he defines emotional regulation as the process by which individuals influence which emotions they have, when they have them, and how they experience and express their emotions. Emotional regulation can be automatic or controlled, conscious or unconscious, and may have effects at one or more points in the emotion producing process. So emotional regulation refers to kind of our control center, or our brain. This is the way we process how we feel, and in turn how we express what we feel. So emotional regulation is a key element to our emotional control. And how are learning difficulties and emotional regulation related? So as I mentioned, it is super common for students with learning difficulties to struggle with emotional regulation. Again, this is mostly due to a processing deficit, or that struggling to process nonverbal cues and information. Emotional regulation, otherwise known as emotional control, is one of the 8 pillars of executive functioning. So executive functions refer to the set of cognitive processes that are necessary for cognitive control of behavior. So these are the little elements that affect a person's ability to control their behavior and how they might go about doing that. So the other 7 pillars of executive functioning are working memory, task initiation, organization, planning, self-monitoring, cognitive flexibility, and impulse control. So as I'm sure you're seeing as you're going through this, or as you're hearing the 7 pillars or the 8 pillars of executive functioning, you might be thinking about children you work with, maybe your own child, a child you know that may struggle with learning, or maybe they struggle solely with emotional control and their emotions. You'll likely notice that there's some overlap. So a lot of students with learning difficulties often struggle with organization as well as emotional control, or they struggle with planning as well as that cognitive flexibility, being able to adapt information and make changes. So that's how learning difficulties and emotional regulation are kind of linked. Looking more into that, executive functions enable students to manage their emotions and their thoughts in order to work more efficiently and effectively. So we know that when a student has maybe more regulated emotional control, they are able to participate more in their school day, and they're able to complete tasks more effectively. But when a student struggles with those executive function skills, their ability to regulate emotions is inhibited. So when they're struggling with their emotional control, their ability to, express their emotions and kind of cope with emotions in a more healthy manner is usually inhibited. Students that struggle with emotional regulation will often experience difficulty tolerating criticism or frustration. So something that you may see either with your own child or in your classroom. They may seem to react more strongly or overreact to their environment, as well as changes or transitions. So again, looking at that cognitive flexibility. Or they may be more likely to react with a fight, flight, or freeze response. So again, all of those kind of more challenging responses to are more unregulated responses to an emotional challenge. So what I would like to do now is kind of look at defining emotion. So if we know what emotional regulation is, what does emotion mean by itself? So emotions are difficult to define, and I have a few definitions that we're going to look through. So Merriam-Webster defines emotion as a conscious mental reaction, such as anger or fear, subjectively experienced as a strong feeling, usually directed towards a specific object, and typically accompanied by physiological and behavioral changes in the body. It's also defined as a state of feeling or the affective aspect of consciousness, feeling. Similarly, Oxford Dictionary defines emotion as a natural, instinctive state of mind deriving from one's circumstances, mood, or relationship with others, or an instinctive or intuitive feeling as distinguished from reasoning or knowledge. So these are some definitions of emotion I looked at when forming this webinar. So what we can take away from defining emotion is that emotion is difficult to define. There's no one concrete definition of what emotion as a whole is. We also know that emotions are subjective, and they're subjective to the individual as well as their environment. So individuals may do different things with different emotions at different times based on where they are, who they're around. And we know that emotions describe a range of feelings and physiological reactions. So because we know that emotions can be so difficult to define, this is why we label our emotions separately. So we know that we have an emotion or a feeling that is mad, and we know we have a feeling that is happy, and that those have different appropriate physiological reactions. So looking at that and emotions and how self-regulation plays a role in emotions, we know that self-regulation deals with the way a person manages their emotions and behaviors when experiencing a situation that is difficult to manage. So now we're kind of seeing how emotions, emotional regulation, and self-regulation all connect. Understood.org, which is a fantastic website. If you have never been on it, I highly recommend checking it out. It's especially great for caregivers and parents. So if that's you, I highly recommend taking a look at it. It's all these resources for those who have either children or students with learning differences or behavioral challenges or attention issues. So that's a really great resource. But anyways, understood.org uses the helpful analogy of a thermostat when looking at self-regulation. So Understood says, you can think of self-regulation in terms of how a thermostat works. A thermostat is set to kick on or off to keep a room at a certain desired temperature, a set point. To do that, it needs to keep track of the temperature changes, compare them to that set point, and know whether to heat or cool the room to get back to that desired temperature. So self-regulation is a child or a person's ability to determine where their set point is and continue to kind of monitor that. So when you're looking at a child and if they're struggling to kind of maybe keep themselves at that happy set point or that happy medium, it may be because they're struggling with that aspect of self-regulation. So their ability to kind of get themselves back to a medium point. So yeah, children also have a set point. The set point is when the child is able to appropriately handle their emotions and behaviors. So despite what's going on around them, despite maybe they had some issues earlier that day, some setting events, the child is still able to kind of bring themselves back to that happy set point, that happy medium. That would be a definition of good self-regulation, or a child that is able to self-regulate. To maintain the set point, the child must actively track the changes to their environment. So again, this is where that self-reflection is critical. So being able to maintain that state of a happy medium or a set point is very critical. It's very important to ensure that they're looking at what's happening around them and things that have happened to them throughout the day, assessing how that makes them feel, and choosing how to appropriately react. So again, this involves actively assessing how they feel, how they're reacting, and comparing that to their set point. From here, the child must learn to make adjustments in order to return to their set point. So again, good self-regulation requires being able to monitor how much you've kind of strayed from that set point, and how to make adjustments to get back there. And this is something that even I see many adults that struggle with this. I'm sure people can even I can think of times where I struggle with this. And it may just depend on what has occurred around you, your environment. But we're going to be talking about how teaching emotions to children can help them with self-regulation and can help them determine how to get themselves back to that set point. So again, self-regulation deals explicitly with how the child processes information and emotion and what the child is able to do with that information. So again, this is why we see a lot of students with learning difficulties that struggle with self-regulation because of that processing piece. If there's already a processing deficit, we know that a child is going to struggle with the self-regulation piece because it requires that ability to kind of process and make adjustments that they may be struggling with. So now I'm going to talk about teaching emotions to children. There are several ways that you can teach emotions or teach children about emotions. The strategy that you decide to use can depend on the child's age and their maturity level. For example, when working with a child who is at the primary level, I may use something like an emoticon chart and ask them to point to the image that indicates how they're feeling. So with an older student, you might have them journal about how they're feeling and ask them to answer some questions in their journal entry. So for example, you might have them ask something like, what happened to make you feel that way? What would you like to do to improve that emotion, and so on. So there's lots of ways that you can teach emotions to kids, and those are just kind of 2 suggestions. I apologize. I'm just kind of making a small check-in with the box on the side just to make sure that everybody can hear me okay. And so far we look good, so I'm going to continue. So methods for teaching emotions to children include, something I like to do is teach the child simple feeling words. So what I mean by this is begin with words like happy, sad, scared, mad, worried, and associate those with emoticons or associate those with facial expressions, and just get the child kind of looking at that and really trying to take in what the words happy, sad, scared, mad mean. Another thing I suggest is create opportunities to talk about emotions. You would be amazed how many opportunities there are within a day to talk about emotions with a child, with anyone. Something I recommend doing is if you're watching TV, maybe take a look at the character and talk to your child and say, how do you think they're feeling right now? Or how do you think that made them feel? And just take a few minutes to kind of talk about it. This is a really good way to get them to kind of reflect on something that they watch all the time, and it may help them when they're experiencing their own emotional difficulties. Another great idea is if you're reading a book, you can pause and say, hey, how do you think Harry felt in that chapter? Or when you're telling your own stories from work, maybe talk about that, or from the day at the dinner table. Also model and label your own emotions. Modeling plays a really big role in how children experience emotions and how children feel about their own emotions and how they express emotions. So when you're feeling something, even if it's happy, maybe saying, wow, I feel really happy right now, and just making sure that you're taking a moment to label that emotion in front of the child so that they can hear it and they can see what happy looks like for you. And maybe saying why you feel happy. And similarly, if you're sad, maybe saying what's making you sad and what you're going to do. So, for example, maybe today I'm a little sad because it's still another day of lockdown or quarantine, and I miss being able to go out and do things. But what I can do is take that emotion and think about all of the things that I have and all the things that I can do rather than what I can't do, and really just model that emotion, but think of healthy ways that I can express it. So another thing that you can do is positively reinforce those positive expressions of emotion. So when you see your child, maybe they've had a rough day at school, maybe they got into an argument with a friend, but instead of coming home and sulking or taking it out on a sibling or a parent, they decided to go outside and play for a bit or go for a walk, or they asked you if you could go with them for a walk. That would be a situation where you would really want to make sure that you're positively reinforcing that reaction to their emotions. So what I would say, or something I suggest saying, is maybe just making a point of being like, I know this is a really difficult day for you, or I know that, that argument with your friend was really frustrating, but I'm really proud of the fact that you decided to go for a walk, to think about it and talk about it instead of reacting poorly. So just really making a point of positively reinforcing that healthy expression of an emotion. I would also provide strategies for how to deal with difficult emotions. So if a child comes to you, or if you notice that they're having a difficult day or a difficult time with something, something I recommend is maybe giving them a few ideas of something they can do to deal with that. Oftentimes people react poorly because they don't have strategies to react positively, right? So something that I recommend doing is maybe saying, hey, like, I know you're not feeling so great right now. Would you maybe want to go for a walk? Or if you're doing something else, would you want to take a break from that? Or even just asking, is there something you'd like to do right now? And obviously within reason, trying to make that happen, or trying to give them some space, because that might be what they want. And lastly, something I recommend is help the child to label their emotions, but avoid labeling emotions for the child. So something that you could say is, would you say that your friend getting upset with you made you feel sad? So that's a good example, because you're not telling the child that they feel sad, or you're not saying, I can see that you're sad. You would say, you're asking it, or you're framing it in a question, so that if perhaps maybe sad isn't what they're feeling, they have an opportunity to correct you. Or that also helps them if maybe they're having a hard time labeling that emotion, you're providing them with a suggestion. Another option for maybe a child that's a little bit more advanced, or a little bit more knowledgeable about their emotions, you could even just say, how would you say you feel right now? Or how would you say that made you feel? And give them an opportunity to talk about it and label it on their own. So those are some ways that you can teach emotions to children within your home or at school. And now I'm going to get into some at-home activities for managing emotions. So there are a number of ways that you can practice healthy emotion identification and management at home. And these are just some of those methods. So you could play emotion charades. You could read an emotion-themed book. There's so many out there, and I'm going to get to those within the next few slides. You could watch an emotions-themed video. You could participate in an emotions-themed scavenger hunt. And again, I'll be talking about all of these over the next few slides. If you have a younger child, or a child that's maybe a little bit more musical, you could sing or create songs that discuss emotions. I recommend creating and using an emotion check-in chart, or you can seek out games that explore emotions and play them as a family. There are tons of emotion-themed games and activities that you can purchase on Amazon or Teachers Pay Teachers. And again, I'll get to those in the coming slides. And I know that this slide is titled At-Home Activities for Managing Emotions, but if you are an educator or a teacher, and you're looking for classroom activities, these are some great ones that can be adapted to use in a group of children as well. So activity 1 is emotion charades. So this is a great activity. I've played this with many groups of BEST children. Before I was in this role with LDANR, I was also an instructor with the BEST program. And we played this almost every time I instructed. And it was great. The kids really enjoyed it, and it really got them thinking about how different emotions look. So something that you can do with your child or in a classroom, you'll want to begin by taking cue cards or strips of paper and writing out simple words for various emotions on each piece of paper. So one word per piece of paper, happy, sad, angry, surprised, worried, etc. And you'll place all the words in a bowl or a container of choice, and you'll select either a child, or if you're just doing it with one child, you can take turns going back and forth, but the child will go up, and just like regular charades, they'll try and act out the emotion on the card, and everybody involved will take turns kind of guessing what they're acting out. And again, this is really good practice for seeing what emotions look like, and also being able to, if they're acting out an emotion and maybe they're not portraying it typically, that's a good chance to kind of correct and discuss that. So emotion charades is a great activity, and that is something that I've had really great success with in groups of children. Another activity is to read an emotions-themed book with your child. There are so many children's books that focus on emotions and healthy expressions of challenging emotions that you can find online for purchase via Amazon or probably through your local library as well. I'm sure that a lot of these are available there. So after this webinar, I'm going to be sending an email out to all of you, and it will have an activity guide attached to it. Towards the end of the activity guide, I have put together a list of emotions themed and healthy expressions of emotions reading list, and you'll be able to find all of these books there. Again, I'm pretty confident that you'll be able to access these through your library or maybe your child's school, but if not, they are available for purchase online. You can also, if that's not an option, or if you have an older student who maybe wouldn't, or an older child who wouldn't be interested in a children's book, you can also use books that you already own as a way to discuss emotions. So as I mentioned, maybe if you're reading through Harry Potter, you can ask the child when they get to that end of the chapter, how do you think Harry was feeling there? Or how do you think this incident made Ron feel? And you can kind of go through it and give them different prompts to kind of talk about emotions, but using a book that they are already interested in. So here are just some examples of emotions-themed books. These are some excellent children's books. I've read, I believe, all of these with groups of children, and they always go over really, really well. Some of my favorites are by Jamie Lee Curtis. She has so many great books that are on emotions and kind of socializing, and she just does such a great job making them fun to read. And fun for the children to kind of look at and participate in. So I highly recommend any of her books. And as I mentioned, I will be sending you guys out an activity guide following this webinar that you guys can use, hopefully with your classroom or with your children. And it will contain a list that has these books incorporated in that. Another activity that you could do with your child or with a group of children is participate in an emotions-themed scavenger hunt. So again, very similar to with the emotions themed charades, you would begin by writing down simple words for various emotions on cue cards or strips of paper. Again, these can be words like mad, sad, happy, upset, disappointed, shocked, surprised. And you can put those in a bowl or a container of choice and take turns amongst yourself and the children, selecting a new card from the bowl. Each card that a person takes indicates the emotion that everyone playing has to look for. So for example, if everyone is looking for sad, everyone has to look for that. Or if somebody selects sad, everyone has to look for that. Then on the count of 3, you'll let everybody go and everybody will begin searching the environment. So through books, websites, television shows, magazines, whatever you have around your house, posters, to find somebody who is expressing the emotion sad, or to find that word or something that relates to that emotion. And then the first person to find someone acting out the emotion wins the round. And you could play this so many different ways, but it's a great group activity and it's a great way to get people or to get children looking for emotions in their environment. So that is something I recommend doing. So another option or another thing I recommend is watching an emotion-themed video or movie. So there are so many different emotions-themed videos and movies out there available online. Again, I put a list of viewing content in the activity guide that I will be sending you all following this webinar. I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record, and you can find a short list of videos and movies to watch there. But this is a really great way to introduce your child to emotions in a more subtle way. So it may make them feel like maybe they're just watching a movie or watching a video, not really realizing. One of my favorites of all times, and I know this is kind of a classic for emotions, but it's Inside Out. I highly, highly recommend, if you have not seen this movie or have not watched it with your child, definitely watch it. It is such a great movie for introducing various emotions and kind of shows that emotional regulation control center. Like it does a lot of what your emotions are like inside your brain and how that controls a child's body. So I highly recommend giving that a watch. It's such a great way to introduce your child to emotions. And it's just a really cute movie. And it can be a great way to start those discussions about feelings. So again, if you have a child who maybe doesn't show much interest in talking about emotions or feelings, this might be a good way to like subtly start that conversation. And again, make sure you keep an eye out for the activity guide that I'm going to send you guys at the end of the webinar for video links and recommendations. Another option, I find this works best for really young children. However, if you have a more musical child, they might be interested in this. Singing and creating music has no age limit. So something I recommend is begin this activity by asking the child how they are feeling right now. Ask them how they would describe that feeling. And as you're going through this, either have the child write down their answers or you can write down their answers. And then maybe ask the child to try singing what they're saying or try to make their feelings into a song. So maybe they can try rhyming words with what they're feeling. Maybe they can try talking about what happened to make them feel that way and putting some rhythm and sing-songiness behind it. And what you'll want to do is kind of play along during this and help the child kind of create a rhythm to go along with their music. This can be a really great way, especially if the child's maybe having kind of a more difficult day or they're feeling upset. Sometimes putting that in a song or talking about it that way can kind of help turn things around and maybe even improve their mood while getting all of that kind of off their chest. This is probably one of my favorite activities. I've also incorporated this into the activity guide, so you guys will be able to have the step-by-step on how to do this with your child. But this is an emotion check-in chart. I love this because I think it's so simple and so basic, but it really does create a method to keep emotions as a kind of item that you talk about throughout the day. So what you can do is you can either create or print off a chart with a range of emotions clearly labeled on them. Place the chart on your fridge or another magnetic surface. And at the beginning of each day, ask the child to pick out their feeling. So maybe your child just woke up, they're feeling good. Maybe they'll put the magnet over top of the satisfied face. And then maybe when you end the day, when they're getting home from school, maybe have them do it one more time. So maybe say, okay, how are you feeling now that you're just home from school? And maybe they'll put the magnet on top of bored. So maybe they had kind of a boring day at school and that's how they're feeling and that's what they select. This is great because it only takes a few moments to do. It can start a great dialogue because you can ask, why are you feeling that way? Or why did you select that? It also helps younger children because they have the emotion or the image to kind of match that feeling. So if they can't necessarily read, they can look at the facial expression to make that determination. And again, this can be done multiple times a day. It also shows the child how an emotion doesn't really flatline, right? Our emotions change and go up and down throughout the day. So they might see that at the beginning of the day, I was feeling happy, and now I'm feeling bored, and those are things that can change. So this is something I really love. And again, this is included in the activity guide, so I hope you guys can take advantage of this either at home or in school. So another activity and something that I really love is playing emotions-based games. There are so many of these that you can find on Amazon. I know Chapters Indigo sells a number of emotions-based and mindfulness games. And there are also a number of classic games that can be modified using emotions. So for example, you could take the game memory. So when you have all of the cards kind of flipped over and they have to find two cards that match by flipping them over two at a time. that can be a great game that you can alter, but using duplicates of emotions flashcards. So placing those all face down, then having the child kind of flip them over until they find the match. There are also so many emotions-based games, as I mentioned, available on websites such as Amazon. You can also find them on Indigo and Chapters, Kohl's, like I said, all of those kinds of websites definitely have a lot of games like this. And again, in the activity guide, I have some more emotions-based game ideas. Those can be found actually online, which are great. So they're accessible anywhere and they're free. So that is it for this webinar. Those are some strategies to teach emotions at home, as well as some different methods to practice emotions. I really hope you guys enjoyed this webinar and that you feel that you gained some useful information from it. Please feel free to send me an email. I'm more than happy to continue to answer your questions, provide resources as they come up, and I can help you that way. Thank you, and have a great rest of your evening.